In this first lecture on the brain, we're going to look at kind of the overall structure and organization of the brain, look at the embryonic development, and then look at something called the triune brain hypothesis, which is a helpful way of kind of understanding the different parts of the brain and how they interact. And then in subsequent videos, we'll look at the protection of the brain, the meninges, and the blood flow. And then we'll look at the brain stem, the cerebellum, diencephalon, and then in brain 2, we'll look at the higher brain structures, the cerebral cortex, and all those functions. As was the case in the previous lectures, any standard anatomy and physiology book would be good to follow along with when we go into these different aspects if you need a little bit more reference. Again, there are a number of good neurophysiology texts that kind of review the brain. I think I mentioned Neuroscience for Dummies, which actually is not a bad book that kind of looks at all the different connections and kind of the higher functions of the brain. And then in Chinese medicine, the integrative approach, Stevenson's book, Acupuncturist's Guide to Conventional Medicine, the second edition, is helpful as well. She does a nice overview. So those are just some additional resources you might want to consult. So although it looks complicated, the brain actually is fairly easy to understand when we look at it in different sections. So we'll be talking first about the cerebrum. We call this the forebrain. The forebrain really is the newest part of the brain evolutionarily, and that consists of the cerebrum, which is most of the brain, so all of this is cerebrum. And that also includes what's called a diencephalon, which is this region in here. And then the brainstem, all of this sits on top of the brainstem, which has its own threefold division. So there's a midbrain, there's a pons, and then there's the medulla oblongata, which connects with the spinal cord, and that goes through the foramen magnum, the opening in the skull. And then sitting on the back of the brainstem is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, and we'll see that's involved in balance and some basic instinctual activities. And then there are hollow spaces in the brain, not easily seen in this picture, called the ventricles. And they are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And the cerebral spinal fluid flows through these open spaces, the ventricles, into the meninges, which is the layer that covers the brain and spinal cord. So it's going to flow around the brain and spinal cord, and then it will drain into the venous blood supply. So we'll look at that in a separate section. So, as should be pretty obvious, the brain's kind of the central feature of the human nervous system. All mammalian brains have a similar structure, although in humans it seems that the cerebral cortex is about 4 to 5 times larger than the average brain of a mammal of the same body size. A lot of mammals, if you look at dogs and so forth, they have a lot of emphasis on the olfactory area of the brain. We have a less developed olfactory area, but our cerebral hemispheres are larger, and the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer, it's actually only 6 cells deep, outer layer of the cerebrum. So remember, the cerebrum is all of this area here. I'll draw it in red here. All of this area is the cerebrum. Only the very outermost layer is where we do most of our higher cognitive functions. And that's language processing, visual processing. That's where our so-called executive centers are, here in the frontal of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. Our motor and sensory systems, all of that are located in this very thin layer on the outside of the cortices. And in humans, these areas are quite developed. Now, important thing to say is that when you see areas that are developed, more neurons here or there, that doesn't necessarily mean there's higher function. That just means there's more mass there, there's more neurons and more glial cells. If we look at the brain, it's soft, it has a jelly-like consistency. If you just open up the skull and look at the brain, you see it's actually covered in a very hard connective tissue layer. That's called the dura, and that's the outer layer of the meninges. It's pinkish on the outside, white on the inside, and that's because most of the blood flow comes from outside the brain and goes into the brain. There's about between 50 and 100 billion neurons, and they form over 100 trillion synapses. Just incredible amount of connectivity between the neurons in the brain. The average weight of the brain is only 3 pounds. So that's pretty remarkable that this is packed into such a size. You know, it's interesting with a computer, if we potentially made one, we didn't have one even comes close to having this many connections. But if we had that, it would require an enormous cooling system. We actually are able to pack this into, you know, the 3 pounds into the skull, and with our circulatory system are able to cool it effectively. Encephalitis, before I go any further, is just acute inflammation of the brain, and that's typically caused by infections, usually by viruses or bacteria. Viruses are more common. Can be also an allergic reaction to viruses. If the infection also infects the spinal cord, it's called encephalomyelitis. So we'll have a little section in neurology on both meningitis, that's infection of the meninges, which is the covering around the brain, and encephalitis. The brain isn't highly discussed in Chinese medicine, and there's a lot of sort of discussion as to why that is. You know, in our current thinking, the brain is kind of the center of integration of everything. It's sort of also considered to be the seat of your higher cognitive functions, what we might call mind, your consciousness, and even potentially your spirit. But in older medical traditions, really the mind was not seen as something localized to the brain. The brain was there to perceive a specific aspect of mind. Mind is more universal, and interestingly, all your organs are picking up on different aspects of the mind. It's interesting because all the organs have their own nervous system. This is usually parts of the autonomic or unconscious nervous systems, but we can say they are like antennas in a way that are sensing maybe not just the environment, but if we talk about higher fields, maybe even higher dimensions, that those are being sensed through the different organs and not just through the brain. So we might say the brain binds us to the physical world, to one type of consciousness, but that there are other types of consciousness available, as we've discussed, and that other organs and different parts of the body might be more tunable to those types of functions. So I'll be discussing that as we go through the autonomic nervous system and the connections with the organs in the brain. So embryologically, the brain develops from the neural tube. So we went through that development in the introductory neurology section. So if you're a little hazy on that, you might want to review that. But the neural tube is one of the first structures that forms in the embryo. And it's really, it comes from the ectodermal tissue, and it gives rise to the nervous system, most of the sensory system, and the epidermis of the skin. Not the neural tube, but the ectoderm. The neural tube then is going to give rise to the brain and spinal cord. And if you look at the neural tube at the sort of head end, cephalic end of the embryo, it kind of bubbles, it forms a sort of lobe. And then if you look downward, there's like a kink, and there's another little bulge, and then there's the spinal cord. And if you look at how this develops over time, it's going to kind of bulge even further and then curl back on itself. Here you can see the developing eye. And then if we look at this last diagram, this is at 8 weeks. The brain has sort of, now we can see the cerebrum developing here pretty clearly. And then here, this is going to be parts of the brainstem itself. And then here we have the spinal cord. So that's going to be the basic development of the brain from the neural tube. As this anterior end of the tube expands, it then constricts into these 3 what we call primary brain vesicles, and we see these constrictions up here. But the brain vesicles will include the prosencephalon, which is the forebrain, and that's going to divide into 2 secondary vesicles. Now the word vesicle usually means like a hollow-filled sac or something like that. That's not the case here. The vesicles just are describing these bulges in the neural tube. So the telencephalon develops into the cerebrum and the lateral ventricles. Those are those cerebral spinal fluid secreting hollow spaces. So that's the telencephalon. And then the diencephalon, this region here, also part of the prosencephalon, will form what's called the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland, and the third ventricle. This is another hollow space. So that's all from the prosencephalon. And again, that's known as the forebrain. The mesencephalon, or midbrain, will form the midbrain structures we discussed in the previous slide. So that actually forms an area called the midbrain, which was sitting on top of the brainstem. And then the rhombencephalon, or hindbrain, This divides into two other secondary brain vesicles, and that's the metencephalon, and that's going to become the pons, and the cerebellum, and then the myelencephalon, which forms the medulla oblongata, which is continuous with the spinal cord, as well as the lower part of what's called the fourth ventricle. So I'm going to go through all these structures as we go, but that just shows you something interesting. Again, here we have another threefold development, first into into prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon, and then both prosencephalon and rhombencephalon divide further into two other sections. So here you can see at 11 weeks, pretty clear forebrain structures here developing. And you see the diencephalon tucked in here. Then here's the mesencephalon, the midbrain, and then here we're going to have the pons, the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. And notice all these little tentacles hanging off here. These are going to be your cranial nerves, and they're going to innervate. So, for example, here's the optic nerve, but they're going to innervate the ear. They're going to innervate the facial muscles, the sensory of the face, the eyelid, the iris, all of those different things. And we'll review these 12 cranial nerves that come off of mostly coming off of the medulla oblongata and pons. And then this structure is going to, in the child, we see that this kind of horizontal angle is going to go upright. And again, this is unusual in mammals. Mammals keep a horizontal axis. In humans, it seems like we've turned upright. And as a result, the cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres, really cover most of the brain. And then the cerebellum is tucked in here. And then here is the brainstem with the cranial nerves and the spinal cord. All right, so that's just a little overview. Hopefully that gives you some context into the different regions of the brain and how they developed. So Paul Mclean was an American physician. He was a neuroscientist. I believe he worked at the National Institutes of Mental Health. He came up with what he called the triune brain hypothesis as a way of understanding the different functions of these threefold sections of the brain. So he really proposed the human brain is three brains in one, and that each has gone through its own separate evolutionary development, kind of starting from the brainstem, moving up to the middle part of the brain, and then moving up to the cerebrum, kind of follows an evolutionary trajectory. It's more complicated than that. We know the brain didn't exactly evolve this way. We see all three parts of the brain all throughout the evolutionary cycle, but it's a helpful way of sort of organizing the functions of these regions. So if we start from the brainstem, Mclean called this the R, or reptilian complex, reptilian brain. So we see this really emphasized in fish and reptiles. But that's just pretty much the brainstem and the cerebellum. And this is all, he sort of attributed this region of the brain to our unconscious instinctual survival memory, so our ancestral memory. So a lot of primal instincts come from this region. And as we'll see, as we study these centers, there are nerves, clusters of nerves. They're called nuclei. Remember, a nucleus in the central nervous system is not a cell nucleus. It's a collection of nerve cell bodies, of the somas, of different neurons. So there are different nuclei in the brainstem that regulate things like breathing and circulation, your heart rhythms, your blood pressure, a lot of your digestive function, your vomiting, things, even simple things like hiccups. All of that is regulated by the brainstem. And so we can think of this as kind of our instinctual survival memory. Sitting on top of that would be what he called the old mammalian brain, and this is going to include parts of the midbrain and then the diencephalon. And this is really our emotional brain. So unlike the sort of will-driven, we can think the R complex is more related to the will, our desires, our drives. The limbic system is more related to our emotions and our personality. So and some memory functions as well. So a lot of our instincts, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual behavior, these are all parts of the limbic system, where we make value judgments, quick, likes, dislikes, sympathy, antipathy, emotional charge memory. This is more of a subconscious region of the brain. We all live in emotions, but they're not quite as clear as like a thought about a mathematical principle or something like that. So in a way, we say they sort of exist at the subconscious level. So that's the limbic system, and this is, he called this the old mammalian brain because the first sort of animals we see with this part of the brain are the mammals. and birds as well have some development in this area. And then the neocortex, this is the cerebral cortex. This is he claimed the last part of the brain to develop. Again, we see portions of the cerebral cortex in lower animals, but basically this is where our higher order thinking skills reside. So reason and speech, intention, creative problem solving, so we create inventions, our conscious mind, more where we do things mentally, we conceptualize. So that's the neocortex, and that sits on top of the limbic system. So I think that's going to be helpful as we go through these different parts of the brain to sort of relate to what they actually do. So thinking about the R complex, more unconscious drives, instincts, limbic system, our emotional brain tied in with our personality, our likes, dislikes, and then the neocortex, more not so much personal. We sort of deal with more higher mental representations here, more part of the collective. And so that's the neocortex. Now, some have argued that there's actually a fourth brain developing, and that is the very front of the cerebral cortex. It's called the prefrontal cortex, and this is the portion right above the eyes, basically behind your forehead. And this portion is really what we associate with executive thinking. So our higher thinking that's able to hold down our impulses, that's able to sort of focus on long-term goals, the bigger picture. So this is, we can say, the last part of the brain that is still developing. And what's very interesting is that there are a lot of nerve fibers that connect these parts of the brain with the limbic system, but also different organs, especially the heart. So we might, when people say heart-based thinking and whatnot, again, thinking outside the brain, you say this is maybe the area of the brain that's able to tie us in with the heart in its perceptions and what it's actually picking up from what we might call the universal mind. Joseph Chilton Pearce makes a strong argument that this is the newest, still evolving part of the brain. This part, interestingly, most of the brain finishes its development in terms of the number of neurons that are going to be present, usually at birth and in most parts by the age of 3. And the prefrontal cortex really goes through a growth surge up until the age of 3. And then it stops, it goes dormant until late teenage years. We start seeing more growth of neurons and higher connectivity in the prefrontal cortex. And then around 21 or so, it stops. So it's kind of interesting how a lot of traditional cultures sort of associated the age 21 with coming into adulthood. Well, that's neurologically sort of paralleled with the development of the prefrontal cortex. And its sort of initial architecture is finally laid down by 21. Pearce did a lot of studies looking at children raised in orphanages and things like this, where, in some orphanages there are hundreds and hundreds, in Eastern Europe, for instance, hundreds of children, and maybe only 2 or 3 attendants, and they go around and they hold the child for maybe just 1 minute a day or 2 minutes a day at best. And he found that when that kind of support is not given adequately in the first 3 years of life, the prefrontal cortex often does not finish its development. And so one of his arguments is that the higher rate of sort of criminality and impulsive behavior that are often seen in those children as they get older might be because of lack of the adequate prefrontal cortex development. It's obviously controversial because there's a lot of other factors there, just the social factors of being raised without parents and this orphanage. But I think neurologically it does point to an interesting idea that a lot of the things we are now punishing, a lot of criminal behavior and whatnot, we might want to look at them also neurologically and say, if your prefrontal cortex is not developed for a variety of reasons, it's going to be very hard for a person to hold down impulses, to function kind of as an integrated person in society and so forth. So we can say this part of the brain is not really finished for most of us. It's still undergoing development. Pearce and others actually argue that we need to consciously work on developing this part of the brain, to really work on setting long-term goals and working towards something or aligning with higher values and not being driven by our brainstem kind of instincts only. So that's maybe a topic for further discussion, but that could be considered maybe our fourth region of the brain. All right, so that's a little introduction to the brain and the different regions of the brain and their functions. In the next little lecture, we'll move into the meninges, cerebrospinal fluid, and look at brain circulation.